a little hands-on as well of how to run, because I did this yesterday with Elaine for showing how to run the syntax for running second-level analysis, but I don't know if everybody got that. So we could do that as well. But I don't know. Those are all of the options of what we could talk today. So what do you think? What do you guys think?
I definitely think touching on some of the syntax for the second-level one, just to make sure that we briefly talk about it and doing it correctly, adding in the covariates correctly based on like the theory, that would be helpful.
Excellent, fantastic. Oh, right, and we also left yesterday the example, and I didn't show how to do the additional covariates or two groups with one covariate, and those we could cover that as well.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, so where do you want to start? Are we all in, or are we waiting for somebody else?
We're all here. Matt isn't able to make it, and we're not sure where Saul is. So as far as we know, he's not here.
Okay, no problem. So
Alfonso, for whatever reason, I can hear everyone else really like loud and clear, but you I cannot so much. Is it possible for you to turn your mic up?
Right, let me check that.
Same here. Elaine's been pushing the up and down button, depending on who's speaking. You've got like your mouth. All that signal loss and the cable through the Atlantic.
Okay, can you hear me better now, or is it the same?
It's better, yes.
It's a little better, yeah.
Okay, I'll try to, let me see, this is input volume, this is as high as it gets, so I'll just try to speak a little bit louder than before.
Yeah,
it's pretty good now.
Okay. So what do you guys want to do then? Where should we start? Do you want to start with questions or specific issues with your data sets, or should I continue where we will end yesterday with the example of how to run second-level analysis, or should I start with the syntax? What do you guys prefer to do first?
What do you guys think over there? Who's over there, Elaine and Megan?
Megan and Matthias.
I haven't done any hands-on yet.
Maybe if we start with the syntax, that'll lead us into an example, and then we can talk through what that looks like and what that means.
Okay, so let's start with the syntax then. Okay, let me see if I can share my screen first. That should be this. Let's see. I think I have a VNC session somewhere in here. Right here. Can you see my screen now?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, and this should be like a MATLAB window on the VNC session with the cluster.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So the general syntax for running the second level analysis is using this is column, module, GLM, and then you specify these four things, X, Y, C, and M. And if you recall from yesterday, X is the design matrix, Y is the data matrix, C is the between subjects contrast, and M is the between condition contrast. So these are normal or regular matrices. The X should be just an N by M matrix of numbers. Y contains the files that you want to, since that should be the data matrix, so that contains the files, and that is basically a cell array also of the proper dimensionality. So if you have like n subjects and two conditions, you have an n by 2 array, cell array, with each entry of the cell array having the individual file names. And then C is a vector or a matrix with the between subjects contracts, and then is also a vector, a row vector or a matrix with between condition contracts. So let's see if I can create an example of this.
I have one if you want to pull mine up. I don't know if that's easier.
Yeah, that would be fantastic, yes.
Yeah. Let me direct you to it. I have a bunch of different ones. So if you go to ACE into ACE reorg and the preproc pipeline.
Okay, let me see why. Okay, ACE reorg and then preproc pipeline.
Yeah, preproc pipeline. And then let me see, I have a couple in there. Let me just see which one would be good. If you do the one that's called conservative QA.
Conservative QA.
Yeah, that has a matrix and a con list in it, which should be the two things that you need.
That has a matrix and okay.
So the matrix file defines my subjects, but it also has motion in there. So I don't know if you want to just ignore that. And then the con list is where all my con files are in the directory.
Okay, but this the con list, I see. Okay, and this basically is the design matrix then. This one? Okay, let's see. So let's call this X just to have it there. And now what was it? The con list.
Yeah.
Con list mat. Con list. Oops. That is actually the proper thing already. So fantastic. So let me see, just to make sure that everything. Okay. Okay. So this is the proper actually format of this variable. So there is nothing much to say about that. But let me just color bar. Let me show the design matrix. Okay. So the design matrix, if I got it right, is zeros and ones. So these are zeros. And these are ones, and these are zeros. So these are two groups, and then this is an external covariate, right? That it has values for them.
Mean motion that's been centered.
Okay, cool. And mean X should be 0 for the last column, which is what we're looking for. Okay, fantastic. And this is mean motion across all subjects, right? And you want to do basically the comparison between the two groups, controlling for potential difference in mean motion between the two groups, right?
Yeah.
Because the two groups might have different. Let me just quickly check that. Let's say I call this X motion, and I do HFV DAF equal GLM X1, 2. This is okay. This syntax probably seems familiar because I'm doing the same. I'm using the design matrix, but now I'm entering this. I'm using const-glm, which is kind of like the underlying functionality for doing the GLM analysis, but in here it expects actually numbers. So basically, I'm trying to see whether there are differences between in motion between the two groups. So I'm running a t-test and using this between subject contracts and entering this as the design matrix, so just the two groups difference, and that will give me basically the p-value for the difference. So well, yes, there are differences between subjects. Between the two groups in the mean motion, and the difference is in the direction of higher motion in the second covariate, in the second column, which is the first subset of groups.
Which is the
that's the patients.
Autism, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
Okay, great.
So yes, when you have something like that, where you have like difference between groups in some covariate that might also be causing difference in activation, then you have that potential confounding effect, and you want to control for that. So that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's just run it, and I think I left it like that, so we can run it. So define
if these come out the same, would you have not included that covariate?
If it was not significant, if there was no significant difference between the groups, then there is not much reason to control for it. It's only when it appears to be so for something to be a confounding effect, it has to have an effect on both things. It has to have an effect on the things that you are measuring. In this case, the two groups. Basically, it has a difference between the groups, and it has to have an effect or potential effect on the functional measure that you are looking at. And this kind of like motion basically. Has those two properties. It is potentially something that affects functional data because you can get higher activation due to motion and things like that. And it's something that in this case also probably affects you found that it affects also the difference between the groups. So then when you are looking for potential difference between the groups in functional activation, you want to discount the potential motion effects. If there was no difference between the groups in motion, then you could add motion as a covariate, but it shouldn't have too much of an effect. And you are removing 1 degree of freedom, so you don't have a reason to do it. You typically don't do it. But in this case, yes, there is a very strong evidence that there are differences between the group motions. So this is a very clear-cut case where you definitely need to include it.
Yeah, and just to clarify that I did this correctly. So what I did was I took the mean motion of everyone, and then I subtracted that from each person's individual one. So I ended up with centering all of them.
Right, exactly. So if you have something like motion are these values, but let's say that originally they were these values, and so what you do is basically create a new covariate that is centered, and you can do that many ways. Basically, this typically.
Okay, good. That's what I did.
Just remove the mean and enter that as your covariate.
Okay. Just want to make sure.
Yeah, you don't typically This is a tricky question. When you want to control for it, basically, when you want to try to control for motion and look at the difference between the groups controlling for motion, then you do exactly this. In some other cases where you might want to have the model consider the potential motion by group interaction, so that means potential difference in the effect that motion has on the functional data, that might be different between the groups. And if you want to do that, then you typically, what you do is you enter two covariates instead of just one for the motion covariates, one that is restricted to the first subjects, another one that is restricted to the second subjects. And in those cases, then you center it only within the subsets that you care about. But in this case, where you want to just control for potential difference in motion between the two groups, then you just enter a single covariate and you mean center it across all subjects, and that is perfectly fine. And the only reason to mean center is just so that the individual effects, these effects that are telling you basically the average connectivity values, they get similar interpretation. But the centering, if you're just caring about the difference between the two conditions, controlling for that particular case is not necessary actually to center. It's only when you are looking at the effect sizes, what was actually the size of the effect in one group versus the other. Those things are affected by. Sorry, when you want to look at the effects within each group separately, basically look at the measure of how much the activation was in this group and in the other one. For those analyses, you want this variable to be centered, because otherwise the mean, well, they are going to be biased to higher values or lower values depending on the mean on the motion covariate. But when this bias affects the two groups in the same way, so that's why if you only care about the difference between the two groups, you don't care about the centering really. Okay. That's just too much information, perhaps, but yeah, this is perfectly fine. This is actually the sign metric is correct. And the only thing that we didn't mention was what was the contrast that you need to use for that. Do you want to venture what you think might be these two, the C and M things in this case?
So C would be, is it 1, -1, and 1? 1, -1, and 0?
Okay, one of the two. Yes.
Those are my
exactly. That was it. Basically, when you want to look at the difference, this is interpretation is that you put a 0 as anything that you don't care about, and when you do that, the things that you care about are always estimated at the 0 level of the additional covariate, and that's why the 0 level the mean is important to be mean centered, because the 0 level of the mean covariate is going to be 0 at this case, which is just fine. It's the average across all subjects. But yeah, typically when you have multiple additional covariates that you don't care about, you basically enter the contrast as you would normally, and then just enter zeros for anything that you just added to the model, but you really don't care about. You just want to control for it. So if you had two covariates added and you want to control for them, you just enter 1 - 1 0 0 and so on for anything that you don't care about. But by you don't care about, what I mean, just sort of you get a little like the sense of it all basically is that the model is actually informed by the motion. That's why it's already getting better estimates of the actual effect sizes within each group, because the model, the GLM model, does know what the amount of motion was for each subject, so it's able to account for that. It's only that when you're looking at the contrast, what thing do you care about when you want to make your hypothesis testing? Basically, when you want to inquire the result of the model about some property that you care, and that property that you care about is basically the difference between the two groups.
Okay, so it's included. You don't care about it because I'm not actually looking for the amount of motion differences between the group, but it's incorporated into the model because I'm saying, okay, I'm putting it in as a covariate. So that's the way it's.
Exactly. That is another contrast that you could use for this, for example, would be something like this. If you enter this contrast, then you would be inquiring, the same model would be fit to the data, it would be exactly the same model, but now you are inquiring for a hypothesis testing. Well, what was the size of the motion to functional data covariation? How much the functional data covariates with motion and in what places? This is what the question that you are asking with this contrast. And if you do this contrast, then you are asking what is the effect within the patient's group after controlling for motion. And if you ask this contrast, is what is the effect in the control group after controlling for motion? What is the average activation within that group controlling for motion? And in this, that is the original one, is what is the difference between the effects, the activation in the two groups when controlling for motion. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, and then for M, you just would use 1 because you have just one column in the Y matrix. And I'm not gonna run it here because remember, one thing that you need to do is create a directory that is gonna overwrite whatever it is in your current directory.
Oh, you can overwrite that. That's okay for that one.
Can I overwrite?
Yeah, I overwrote because that's actually the one where I was trying to do this contrast. Okay. So definitely overwrite it.
Okay, so there you go. So just run that, and if everything goes according to plan, it should take just less than a minute to run that.
The big reveal is you're probably not going to see anything, so don't get too excited.
Okay, cool.
All right.
Yep. Okay, and that's the two-sided results, and yeah, we don't see anything here. Let's see. If you just want to see what it is, let me see.
So Liz, is this a speech minus baseline contrast or a specific condition contrast?
So this is speech minus baseline, and this is the difference between controls and patient.
Yep.
So controls greater than patient, or two-sided, right? So controls different than ASD in speech minus baseline. So
Gotcha.
Yeah, I don't have other contrasts in this particular one.
Okay, so there is a huge amount of variability because you don't see anything even just at this level. You see almost no clusters. These are very small clusters. So there is a huge amount of variability. That means that the residual error is relatively high. So perhaps you can try to smooth considerably more than whatever you are doing now. So,
okay.
Because at this level, you should see larger patches, and the fact that you are not seeing that, it probably means that you look at your individual subjects just for a second.
Well, I know there's a lot of variability, but theoretically, pretending that this wasn't a design that we know about, couldn't that mean that the two groups aren't different in speech minus baseline?
Right, it could be, yes, but they are, but this is, well,
they probably are. I'm just kind of
equal.
Yeah.
It could perfectly be, yes, that they are fine, but if, yes. I don't know, it looks suspiciously low, this level of results at that level. So basically, so how to put it, when you use this threshold, you should see at least 10% of, 1% of active voxels, and those typically happen at relatively larger clusters. And in this case, I'm seeing much less than that. So that's probably an indication that you have a lot of residual errors. So I just to double check, I mean, this is just for the learning also thing. Just for quality assurance, you want to make sure that the individual subjects look fine. Let's select all of them. If I could. Okay. Let's see. So this is okay. Okay, so there's a lot of variability at that level. So yes, you have some suspicious subjects. This stuff in here looks very much like motion related. When you see this type of bands of activation at the very borders of the brain, that looks like motion pretty much. So this has huge effects of motion which haven't been corrected even after. This already is after motion correction and quality and outlier removal, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that looks a bit bad. Let's see, and the rest are just noisy, but not. Yeah, and this looks also suspiciously.
What's that? Who's that?
Yeah. Yeah, that is also some problem. Probably more. Well, that's kind of like inverse motion related.
That's a t = 2.
That's a t = 2. Yeah, that's.
And that's wait. Well, what do we now? We know we're not looking at the difference. We're looking at.
Oh, sorry. I was just looking at this. I mean, we can do this later. This is not related to today's elaboration, but this was just looking at individual subjects, speech minus baseline contrast, just to see whether there was some potential outliers that were affecting the results, and that could justify why we are seeing so little power to detect this difference. So, I mean. The results here seems to suggest that there's little power. It's not just because there is no results, it's only because when lowering the threshold, you still see very little. You should see much more than this. And that could typically be because of outlier subjects or something, or huge amount of variability, or just outlier subjects. So that's why I went and look at individual subjects data just to see what is going on. And there are a few subjects that perhaps merit looking into those, just to make sure that. So and this is also a good, basically, a recommendation in general. Before you get too carried away with the second level analysis, try to get your data, first level data, as clean as possible, because otherwise you're going to do a lot of back and forth, and you're going to end up biasing yourself towards stopping when you find whatever you were looking for. And that's not a good recommendation. The recommendation is try to focus on your first level analysis as much as humanly possible until you are so confident that they are as good as they can be, that you are ready to move on to second level analysis, and then move on to second level analysis, because that would avoid this kind of like back and forth. And then if you find something that follows your expectation, then you don't go back and try to fix anything. But if you don't, you go back and try to fix it, which is not a good general recommendation. So anyway, general recommendation.
So then I guess the best thing would be, so going through doing quality assurance for the pre-processing pipeline, when you're doing the first level, and then looking at this sort of GUI for each subject more specifically, and making sure,
making sure that the noise that you see there and the variability that you see there, you are happy with that, and that is as good as you can get. You can even try different preprocessing pipelines to see which one gives you better results. And at that level, as long as you are not focusing on the actual second level analysis that you care about, you are just looking at the quality of the first level analysis, and try to not pay too much attention on which subjects are which. Just try to get the first level results as good as possible. And when you feel that you have done everything that you can to get your first level data as clean as possible, then you move to second level analysis.
Okay, so I think maybe in maybe kind of offline or something, I might need a little bit more help with that, because I've gone through all the first level, but a lot of what I've been doing, just based on how I had to onboard onto this project, was making sure that I saw sort of a speech network activation, therefore the paradigm was working, so a lot was focused on that. Right. So I'd gone through all of these, looking specifically, okay, is there activation in the speech network? If I really lower the threshold, then I guess I'm not really looking specifically for things like the motion or stuff like that, because I was kind of taking that in terms of the contrast, right? I was looking for that in pre-processing. So,
right. Yes, yeah. I'll probably end up adding this type of plots. I lost it. Because
I know we talked about those great
plots in quality assurance. Yeah. Yes, I'll probably end up adding these plots as part of quality assurance. I haven't yet, but I'll probably do that. When you run the first level analysis, you will get basically the first contrast. We mentioned this the other day talking with Jason. The first contrast that you specify will be create a plot with all of those for every subject in this type of probably sagittal displays, where you might be able to better catch whether something is going on strange for that subject. But until that happens, just to create those plots manually, basically, to either using this GUI or something similar to that, to look into individual subject results.
Okay, I must have done that too big picture then. That makes a lot of sense.
So, and one thing that would be helpful would be to have a GUI like this one that we're looking at. It was available at the first level analysis. So I sat down with Elaine yesterday, and we went through the first level results, doing the same sort of inspection, and it just was really inefficient to each time you wanted to. So when we tried to look at individual subjects, you had to look at them on the reference, load them on the reference brain in order to have them all within the same GUI. So to avoid that thing where you have to run the con, whatever that function is, and then you get the first interface where you select things, and you always have to change the threshold and the color bar range. Is it possible for us to sort of like change the defaults and then to do something where we can load them up? Like
yes, definitely. If you let me know which defaults you like, then I'll incorporate those as the default settings for that quality assurance step, and it will be created automatically every time that you run a first level analysis, basically. So let me know which defaults you like. I mean, basically something like sagittal slices, this many slices, change the color to this, and change the thresholds to that, and whatever kind of combination looks best to you, let me know what that is, and I'll just code it as the default settings for those plots.
Okay, I think like the threshold, something like we've been using between -10 and 10, but it could be like 8 or whatever, maybe.
Yeah, lower. Yeah, 10 is huge value for T statistics at the first level.
T stats like maybe 2, and it seems like the outlines around the clusters probably aren't necessary. And then for this kind of inspection, I don't mind if it just stays with a single slice, and you can just rifle through them. If you want to do something that's more like, you know, if we have this thing where you pop up a bunch of the sagittal slices as part of QA, we can do that. But I find that it's nice to have the larger image to look at and to be able to go through the brain and switch.
Right. I'll do that. I'll have the QA generate those plots automatically. So basically, the idea of the QA reports is this. I haven't showed you this, but basically, let me see if I have some report here that I could show you. I probably have some report. Let me just quickly check. Let me check. Oh, come on. Nope. So where is it? Should be here.
I have a QA report in mind if you want to open that one.
See, yes, I don't know. This is not the one that I was looking at. Yes, if you have, but you have a PDF one. I wanted to show an HTML one. I don't want to create it. It's going to take a few minutes. Do you have an HTML one, or do you have the one that you send me the PDF? Well, yeah, if you have.
Yeah. Does it create both? I think I just asked it just to create PDF, unless it automatically creates the HTML as well.
Right, you can choose between a PDF or an HTML file, and then well, yes, if you could please show the PDF example, that would be helpful, I think.
Yeah.
Let me see. I'll stop my share for 1 second so you can share your window as well.
Yeah. How do I get out of? Oh, here we go.
So basically, the idea is that when you will be able to, you are able basically to, once you create these plots, you can create these reports, and the reports are basically one single file or single web page that summarizes all of the plots for quality assurance, and that already includes all of the preprocessing stuff and all of the and a few of the first level analysis, kind of design metrics information and all of that, and these histogram displays. And if you create the web version of it, so basically they look like that. Basically, you can just browse through it, and you will have basically these plots created for every subject. So the idea for these additional plots is that for every individual subject, you will get those displays, multi-slice display from for the sagittal views for the first contrast. And then if you are using the PDF, that's why I wanted to show the HTML. If you're using the PDF, you cannot do much with it. You can just look at it and that's it. But if you're using the HTML version of the report, you can also click on those links and that will launch within MATLAB the window that you are used to, where you can just browse through using a slider through the individual slices and things like that. So this is like the central repository where you have like the set of plots that you want to create, but you can then go just clicking in the corresponding plot. You can just open that plot in MATLAB and you will be able to browse through the individual slices, and, yeah, just to see it in a little bit more detail. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yep. I was going to ask you one, if you could go back to show me what you use to, what is the PDF reader that you use on the cluster? That'd be cool. But so the GUI that you're using for the second level analysis, it looks like what it allows you to do is sort of like go and more easily open up different types of plots that you might want to look at.
Right.
So I mean, we don't have to go over this right now, but as I've gone through a couple of these, I think that there are ways that we can, I mean, we don't want to have a report that has every single possible thing that you could look at. That's my assumption that we don't want to do that. So there is having these, like, we want flexible GUIs so that it's easy to look at the data.
Yes.
So for instance, and it may be that we could just use, at some point you have sort of this like quick check stuff, and then when you want to look in detail, the tools that you have, Alfonso, seem really good. So I'm kind of reluctant to suggest that we jump out of them because I know that there are some limitations with some of the other ones. But one of the things that you find in other ones is that you can have the three different cardinal views: coronal, axial, and sagittal. available, like they're all on the screen and you're clicking around, and the two that you're not clicking in will update to that new location.
Right.
So something like one of the advantages of Freeview is that you have the 3 volume orientations, so the 3 different slice orientations, and a surface plot. So you could do something like load up the data in the volume and have it projected onto the surface, say, and take a look around at everything. Something like that. Those sorts of things are handy to have.
Right.
Handy to be able to do that.
Yes, I mean, some of those are tricky to port to other software packages. Basically, I mean, many of these things are just visualizing in some particular way one file, right? I mean, these things, you can just look at the anatomical file, structural, normalized file, and look at it in using any particular software that you would like. But what this quality assurance plots is trying to add to that, and basically do, like, for example, you have like the one that shows you the M&I template on top of that. Well, it's the M&I boundaries and things like that, and it's difficult to tell you exactly how to do that on different software packages. I mean, because I mean, you will have to play with them to get something like that to overlay. So I can tell you basically which files were used for every one of those things. Perhaps it would be useful to have that in a single. Let me see. How could I mean, we can think about this. How I can facilitate porting this type of plots into different software? So if you are used to using Freeview and you prefer to do that, how can I make it simpler for you to actually do that? What information would you need?
So one of the things that would help me would be if, like, whenever you were looking at a plot, like you look the GUIs that you have, like that. There's that one GUI that's sort of common. Like once you actually select all of the different settings that you want to select, that pops up. If that actually showed you that it's like it had like a link to each of the files that you're looking at, so it's like here's the path to the individual subject's anatomical data that I'm looking at. Here's a path to the functional data that are like the functional volume that's overlaid, say, and then I could play around with that. I feel like, I could play around with that in Freeview, and there might be some things I'd need to do to it to make sure that things are plotted correctly in terms of resolution and like orientation and things like that. But
okay, perhaps I can make it. I see what you mean. I think I could make that a little bit more accessible. So right now, when you're looking at this type of, so there are kind of like 3 levels of displays that we are using. We are using this type of quality assurance report GUI, where you basically will have basically access to all of the plots that you have created, right? And you may have like normally all of the quality assurance plots you can access from them and switch between one plot and another, and then select individual subjects and all of those. This is one level of the GUI. In this GUI is where you can actually create, export a report, these PDF files. You can create them here, create a HTML or PDF or whatever type of report you want, like a summarized version of all of these plots. And in here you can browse through the different subjects. But this basically, if you want to look at the data within each of these plots, well, it depends on the plot. But typically, when you do go to details, you will launch that individual. Then you have this second level of GUI display. This is kind of like the control thing where you have all of the quality assurance plots. These are the individual plots. Each of these plots can be accessible through the individual GUI that was used to create that plot. And in here, you can actually just browse through that data. And if you want to look at the files, that basically these GUIs will tell you in info always the files that were used for that. So basically this is the 2 things that are being plotted here, volumes. But this is not easily accessible because you have to click many times to actually see that. So I could try to make this information a little bit more easily accessible, or I could even create it into a log file or something like that so that you can more easily find out how basically take those files and look them in whatever other software you use. So perhaps for these plots, I can have like a log file or something that create it that it will tell you which files have been used for each plot so that you can more easily access them from other packages? What do you think?
Sure. I mean, I guess this is something I'd want you to spend a ton of time on. I think I like working on the usability of this stuff. So any recommendations, I like hearing about them. I want to make this as usable as possible, and I'm relatively flexible so that accommodates people's preferences. Not that, I mean, different people have different preference, but you guys are my test case. So your preference are going to end up being the default settings for many of these displays. So I want to hear them. Okay, and this recommendation I think is good. It's good to have some type of log file that tells you basically which are the individual files that are being plotted here, so that you can, if you want to use different packages, you can easily do that without having to dig too much, having to go each of these plots, clicking details, and then clicking on info to kind of see what those things that you're looking at are.
Assuming that we're going to be doing this on the cluster anyway, is there a way, like, I know in Python you can just call OS, you could put in like a free surfer call and add a button and just say open in free surfer, and it will automatically open, you know, the volumes that go into the plot?
I could, but I would need to learn the syntax in FSView to do that. So I'll look into that. So that is one possibility, and only if there is a lot of support for FSView that you guys really want to use it, then I'll add it. But if it's just one among many different software packages that you might want to use, then there is limited time as to what things I should focus on. So basically, if this is one software package that you all guys love, and I'll be happy to incorporate how to easily transition from this GUI to that. But if there are just too many of them, I don't want to basically invest too much time in learning about every software package out there to how to do that.
We could just have everybody submit a preference and then weight it by some reasonable thing, like how long you've been.
Right. Okay. That's
in the lab.
Yes, and then
What's for one?
That's a good one. Yes.
I think we all know Preview. That's the only one we know. So
yeah, Preview has been. I feel like I use a lot.
And I learned a lot about.
I would say that's kind of because of my bias, right? Because I've stuck around and I'm familiar with that one, and I've been sort of like, I've looked at the kind of analyses I've done has been mainly like structural analysis and viewing, and basically I've been like viewing data, but I haven't done a lot of from scratch analyses of these things. And so, like the SPM, it would be good for everyone to play around with the SPM one, simply because we're using SPM's tools for a lot of this. So in some ways that might be an easy one to look at. I think you'll get frustrated with it at some point, but well, I guess it could be better than the last time I played with it. But
right, it has these three views display that you like, and then that varies it that you can do with, I think it's called SPM check registration or something like that, to display multiple files using the same view. So that is useful. So yeah, and that is something that I'm familiar with, so I could easily accommodate that as well without having to learn much new stuff. So.
Alfonso, I had another GUI question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Subject numbers. So when you load the subjects in the QA plots, it looks like for me, it comes up now subject basically 1 to 15 missing subject 13, which would correspond to my S rate 1 to 15 missing S rate 13. But then when I get to first level analysis, I think that holds, but at second level analysis, it becomes subject 1 to 14. And then, so at that second level analysis, I don't know which subject, I don't know how it's reading it. Is it now 1 to 14 as like in that order, or if it's like 1, 10, 11, 12, and so on? Right.
I think there is a way to enter yes, that is a good point. The issue is basically that, I don't know if you're seeing my screen. Let me see, go back to here. Basically, when you are running this con GLM, you are not entering your information, you are entering in Y whatever you want. So basically, this process doesn't have any idea which data you are actually using and in what order. If you order it differently, it doesn't have a way to name it. That's why when you are displaying this type of things, you only see like 1 to So subjects are labeled by the order in which they appear. But I think I have the capability to have some labels for individual subjects, so I'll see how to merge it. So if I can change...
if we know the logic, then we can interpret it. But right now,
the logic is just the order in which they were entered here. Basically, the rows of the X and Y matrices are the subject numbers. So if you enter 20 subjects, they will be named 1 to 20, and they will be in the same order as they appear in these two matrices.
Okay. So then it should correspond to the same order as the previous level.
Well, it depends how you created this Y, right? Because you might have resorted you see, when you create the files, the list of files that are going to be entered, you might have chosen whatever order you want here, basically. So whichever order you use in the file selection routine that you use to identify the files that you want to enter in your second level analysis is the same. That is going to be the subject index, basically.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Elaine, what I end up doing for this, because mine are kind of ordered in a way, is I pull all the con files, the con _001, the contrast that I want files, into a string, and then I end up moving that out into, like MATLAB or Excel, and actually make sure that it's only the ones that I want included in that analysis. And then I have that sort of somewhere else labeled. So like right now I have an Excel sheet with the numbers 1 to 22 with these contrast paths on them.
Yeah.
So I know that my actual string has them. So it's just like an extra check for me, because sometimes I'm doing this multiple times and I have multiple pipelines and I don't want to get extra or like the right condition or something like that. So it's just an extra check that seems to help me kind of keep track of it.
Yep, that sounds good.
What I typically do, is just a condir, basically, is to look recursively through directories for one file that I care about. I used that in the other day example. So basically, if I know that all my files are within this subfolders, it depends on how it's organized. But if I'm looking for, let's see, all of the files that are called colon0001.ni, you can use this syntax to give you those files. Let me check. Perhaps there's
going to be a lot.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot, right? Okay, yeah. So depending how you organize things, that might make sense or not. Yeah. And then you can use this other thing. Basically, it's called consort file names, and that will sort them numerically. You know that when you do a dir, it sorts things alphabetically. So you see like srate 10 is going to appear before srate 2, which is complicated. So if you use this, that fixes that, basically. That resorts stuff so that now is also numerically sorted. So srate 10 appears after srate 9, even though it's only one digit, right? So it makes a little bit more sense. So with those two things, typically I use that to select whichever files I care about and put them in the order that I care about, and then I just run second level analysis.
Yeah.
What was that function?
con_sort file.
It's called sort file names. It's just to sort things using both alphabetical but also numerical order. So any numbers that appear, it sorts them numerically rather than alphabetically. And any letters that appears, they sort them alphabetically.
Great.
Can I ask a specific participant question about sort of looking at the contrast files?
Sure.
With the GUI that you have up there, could we pull up subject 11?
Right, let me see. Subject 11.
I'm just trying to get an idea about like what like our internal threshold should be for something that's not good.
Good. Okay.
What my threshold should be. It might be different.
Okay. Again, 11 on this one is, I think I actually messed it. No, let me check which one was 11 again. Because
yeah. 9346. Let's see if I'm right.
Oh, it was Y actually. Yeah, let me see. So Y11. Let me just make sure that we are looking at the one that you think. Is this the one?
Yep.
Okay, cool. And where is my GUI? Didn't show up. What happened? Where are you?
Looks like there was an error.
Maybe there was some error. Or check 11 to minus.
Do you want to look on the subject slice, Liz?
Oh, probably because I use the on subject anatomical, and this guy doesn't have on subject anatomical. For the second level analysis, don't know which one was the anatomical of that. Anatomical
So
file for
that at the top.
Yeah, that's definitely a motion related covariate. Yeah, anything that looks very much like a border thing, that is a band at the border of the
In
band.
that band, the white in the band is
It's
super high,
hugely,
right?
yes, exactly. It just means that it's above 5, basically, in t-values. The t-values are just ridiculously large there.
So that's by far the biggest activation.
It's actually 10 in here, so yeah, it's ridiculous. Yeah, and that's what happens with motion. The problem with motion is that it's a huge effect. So that's why it's always so much concern about potential motion effect. Even residual motion effects are still large compared to the typical.
Is it possible that warping would have something to do with it too? So that's where you see like a lot of signal buildup in that area.
Could be, but I mean, warping should affect things constant across the entire time series, and this is what you're seeing here is basically something that covariates with the speech minus baseline contrast. So it's something that is appearing sometimes and sometimes it's not, and so it's more difficult to be warping. It has to be like a motion by time covariation, basically.
So what do I do for something like this? Do I rerun it again with the more conservative threshold and see if it goes away? Do I have to get rid of them? Like, what can I do?
That's a good question. Whatever you do for the subject, you have to do for every subject, and that's the trade-off, basically. That if you find that you really want to salvage this subject, then whatever, it has to be something that works for everybody else as well. So one thing that you can do is add additional covariates for motion. So I don't know if do you have the config file, or perhaps I can just look at this. Let me see. Well, perhaps this help file. Okay, there is. When you specify covariates in the model, you can specify something like, let me see if it's actually here. Contrast. Come on, did I miss it? It should be here. Covariates. Covariates. Here it is. Okay, so you can enter something like motion. Typically, by default, you enter just motion parameters. But another thing that you can enter is enter motion plus the first order derivatives. This is called the motion 12 parameters, and this is called Freestone 24 because they like Freestone and all like this variation, and they use basically 6 motion parameters plus 6 first order temporal derivatives, and this is 6 motion parameters plus 6 first order derivatives plus the square of everything else. So that's 24 covariates, and this is 12, and this is just 6. So they go increasingly in correcting for potential motion effects. This is the more conservative, but it also consumes the most number of degrees of freedom. But this is in the first level analysis. So depending, if you have degrees of freedom at the first level analysis to spare, then just one thing to try is to try to be more conservative in here. When you are removing the covariation with motion, the additional derivatives are that. If you don't have that as an option, then you could try lowering the threshold for the being more conservative in outlier removal and seeing whether that helps. And if you don't have that option, let me see what else can you do at the level of individual subjects. If all of those basically require having, you can try different, if the residual motion, different motion strategies like if you didn't try the unwarp already, you might try motion using unwarping as opposed to the typical realignment. But I think you are already using that.
So this I went back and I'm not using it for this particular one because I wanted to go back to the direct normalization. Can I use unwarping with direct normalization?
Yes, definitely. You don't need to do
maybe I'll try that then. Because it was getting a little confusing with the indirect. So, okay, so that's a good place to start. And, maybe I just need to not hold on to this subject so much.
Right, exactly. If what
so I was kind of hoping to include it, but it may just need to be its own thing.
Right. If what you need to do to salvage him is just way too much, then for the other subjects, and you are going to end up losing too much power for the other subjects and making the data from the other subjects more noisy because you reduce the degrees of freedom too much, and then it might be not worth it. And so that is another option. So one option is this: try to clean it the first level by adding covariates or removing more subjects, removing more data scans or data points. Another option is to try to remove the subject. Another option is to try to include motion, the level of motion, or subjects that show excessive motion as a covariate in your second level analysis, which you are doing anyway, right? So if this subject ends up being the cause of whatever difference you find between the groups, then that is going to be controlled for by adding the additional motion covariate. It depends on the individual case. For this subject, if it's only one subject, for this case, I will probably, if you don't have enough degrees of freedom, I will use this to see if it improves. If you don't have degrees of freedom, I will probably just either remove it or use it as a second level covariate that controls for that.
Yeah, I think I may need to remove it because right now with the current default pipeline, I only have 41 valid scans and 49 invalid scans. So I was right on the border of it, like even being usable generally.
Right. That's very low.
The freedom. So okay.
Yeah, and this guy is not showing activation what you would as well a little bit.
Yeah, it was really all over the place.
I'm just I don't know if you can, I'm just throwing stuff at the wall here, but when the subject that had just like a ton of activation.
Yeah.
You saw, is that also a subject that had a lot of trials removed?
Yes. So that was the other thing. That one has a lot of trials removed, and I'm looking at it now, and I only it has 13 valid scans and 17 invalid scans. So that's probably one that needs to come out because I think I only had one run for them.
Yeah, that's just very noisy.
So that didn't pop up in my other stuff, but they clearly need to come out. That one I felt comfortable about taking out now. That was a mess. And can we look at just one more?
Sure, no problem.
Can we look at 20?
20 this list, right? Okay.
Yeah, because I was just looking at a bunch, and this one I think is okay, but it's kind of borderline, so I just wanted to get a second opinion.
Okay. Let's see.
Like that all at the top.
This at the top might also be motion related, but
and it's in the
it's a bit less clear, right? And this is also this could all be motion related because it looks, if you look at the sagittal, it's going to look like at the borders of the top. So this could be like a rotation of the head that is causing this type of like very borderline, and you see that it's mostly outside of the brain. So basically, this type of motion effects is when you find something that it looks either border basically like a ring around the brain, and it seems to be more outside than inside. One of the ways that people do in ICA, you know how you can use ICA to detect individual components that might be motion related. Also, that's also an additional thought. There's also a way to correct for motion that people don't use much, but might be useful in these cases. People run ICA, detect noise components, and then remove those from the data. And that's one way to denoise data. And the way to detect the noise components, many times people do it visually and manually, and there are also some algorithms to do that automatically. But the basic idea are the rules like this. Is when you see a component that looks like a ring that is mostly outside of the brain, and it has higher frequency than what other things typically have, then that is all of the indications of noise components, typically motion.
Okay, great, thank you.
No problem.
Would it be an option to just like shrink the mask for all subjects? Because I feel this thing with diffusion, if you say, and there's some like with the tools, they're saying you want to use like a narrow brain mask in order to correct for eddy current corrections.
Right. That is possible, and you could use a little bit more conservative mask to kind of make sure that you're removing the things outside of the brain. But well, the problem is that when there is a motion-related stuff, even if it might only appear like in these very strong, significant things here, it's affecting pretty much the rest of your data. Only that you don't see how it is, so it's not clear how it is. So when there is motion, even if you just focus on the rest of the brain, you will see that that you are going to find residual things in there as well. It's only that they are not as strong. I mean, these things, you see them because they are just ridiculously strong. They are orders of magnitude larger than anything else. But the problem is that when those are motion related, you cannot trust that the same thing hasn't happened at a lower level in different places. So basically, yes,
you might miss how bad your data is. You might not see it.
Right, exactly. Yes, if you just use a more conservative mask and not look at it at all, then you are missing a good indicator of when your data is bad, basically.
I have a silly question just kind of about this visual here. So the overlay, right, is we have the overlay contour.
Yeah.
So if the actual colors are coming up on the brain, but the overlay contour is outside the brain, that's still...
Yeah, it's not showing you the color, but it's showing you the border, basically.
But the border is really where the whole effect is, and it's just
exactly.
not
Yes,
coming
it's only that
brain
yes.
in this picture.
Yeah,
Okay.
if you saw something in here, it won't be color as activation, but it will just still see the border, basically.
There's an effect there. Okay.
Like something in here, for example, this is totally outside of the brain, so it's not showing any color, but it's still showing the border of it.
Thank you.
No problem.
So
Sorry, go ahead.
This was just sort of an aside question that's somewhat related. Does the degrees of freedom that you have in the first level analysis affect the effect size estimates that you get, or just the statistics, like the t-values? Because if it doesn't, or yeah.
So the degrees of freedom, well, it has two sides, that question. Explicitly speaking, the degrees of freedom only affect the statistics. But the degrees of freedom are, so basically the statistics, the t-values are affected by the effect size, the amount of residual error, and the degrees of freedom. Those three things are the things that are combined to create a t-value. You basically are comparing the effect size, dividing it by the standard deviation, basically the standard error, when it's a t-test at least, and then multiply that by the square root of the degrees of freedom to get a t-statistic out of it. So those three things come up in the t-values. And the effect sizes themselves, the degrees of freedom kind of doesn't show up in the computation, but it affects the amount of error that you see in those effect sizes. So basically, if you have very low degrees of freedom, typically the error in those effect size estimations is very large. So if you look at the distribution of effect sizes across the entire brain, you will see that it's a very wide distribution because it's showing a lot of variability that is just error related. And if you have more degrees of freedom and you look at just distribution of effect sizes, it looks more narrow. And that's an indication that you do have sufficient degrees of freedom to estimate those things relatively accurately, and then the variability that you see is true variability. If you have very few degrees of freedom, in addition to the true variability, you see variability resulting from the limited ability of the model to estimate those effect sizes appropriately. So you see always increased variability.
So because the second level is based on the effect size maps, is there like a random effect analysis of the effect size maps, which are not influenced by the degrees of freedom? Is there a downside of increasing degrees of freedom in the first level analysis?
So decreasing, you probably mean. So the lower the degrees of freedom, the worse your data is going to be, basically. But you are right that it doesn't seem to affect, at least not directly in the way that second level analyses are computed, but it affects because the individual measures are affected by the degrees of freedom. So basically, the first level analysis is like a measurement. You take a measurement of something, right? And the degrees of freedom relate to the error of that measurement. You take a measurement that gives you a single value, but you know that the measurement apparatus has some error. There are some worse apparatus than others. So basically, if you have a very noisy measurement device, then you're going to get a single value for your measurement. That is going to be a noisy value. If you do it again, you're going to get a totally different value, and then a totally different value. And if you have some measurement apparatus that is very good and it's very reliable, then the variability is low, the degrees of freedom are large in this kind of like similar that we are talking about, and then you get precise measurements. And if you repeat it a little bit later, you're going to get the same number or close by. So limited degrees of freedom, what it affects is the error, the error in your measurements, in your measures. So when you're getting an effect size, you always get a number, but that number, you have some confidence interval applied to it, basically. And the lower the degrees of freedom, the larger the confidence interval is. So basically, conceptually, the lower the degrees of freedom, the more noisy your individual subject measurements are. So when you enter those second level, when you enter those noisy data in your second level analysis, you're going to get reduced power because the between subject variability is going to contain whatever it was actually the between subjects variability that is true to the effect sizes, variability in effect sizes across subjects. And in addition to that, it's going to have the variability in the within subject measurements. So these confidence intervals, large confidence intervals that you got for getting low degrees of freedom are going to end up adding to your second level analysis variability. So they don't add to the effect sizes of the second level stats, but they typically end up having an effect by increasing the variability of your second level analysis, and that reduces the power and all of that.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
Let me think about it again, and I'll ask you offline if I need more.
No problem.
Thanks.
Well, in general, Alfonso, should it be somewhat alarming that, so if we're masking out the brain parts of the, like, we're supposed to be masking out the parts of the functional image that are not brain, right?
Right.
Is it alarming that you see like an extension this far? I guess this is not this is not the
this is not the actual
anatomy
right
anatomical scan, but
But,
so I guess we don't say much about that. But
it's not at all. That is totally normal. The implicit masking that is, so basically when you run first level analysis in SPM or other software, you might be using an explicit mask, but more often than not, people don't use an explicit mask. They use what is called implicit masking. And implicit masking is relatively liberal. It's trying to find whatever is kind of like some level of activation, just a mask to reduce the entire volume to where the brain is supposed to be. But that is not very tight because you don't want to lose the activation at the border. So that is just generally a very loose way. It's defined by the 1/8 of the average activation size. Already the average activation across the entire volume is relatively low compared to the actual average activation within the brain, and then you're taking 1/8 of that, so that's even lower. So anything that survives that threshold is considered is a voxel that is going to come up in your implicit mask. So basically it's a very liberal mask, and it's perfectly fine to see things outside of the brain. That helps because sometimes you have variability in the actual anatomy between subjects and in the way that the anatomy is laid out. So if you try to be too conservative, you end up having missing data for individual voxels in places where you do care about them, actually. So that's why it's relatively liberal.
Okay, and another question about these data in particular. Liz, we'd seen a couple of scans where the normalization looked like gobbledygook.
Mm-hmm.
Was that corrected?
Not that I know of, but that should be correctable. So basically, I should sit with Liz to get to that.
No, I fixed one of them. I have another one that still I can't figure out. And then so there's only one left where the normalization is garbage. And then I have a couple where registration looks a little off. So I have questions about those too, but none of those were these.
Okay,
so
none of those are these.
Here, I had gone through and I thought that these quality assurance plots were fine in terms of normalization and decent registration, at least.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. So those aren't here.
Okay.
So we'll get to those soon. Do you have any other questions?
I mean, I wouldn't mind having one of these not go to 4:15 if possible, but I know everybody wants to, and I do want to learn it as fast as possible too, but maybe just let this seep in. Are there any other like specific holdups that people have right now that we should discuss? Or
I mean, yeah, Alfonso, I'd love to talk with you about some of those, but we don't need to, if there's anything that the group would be more helpful for, that's something that you and I can just talk about if you have some time.
Right, that's no problem. Yes, at all. We can do that actually. Well, after this, I have a thing for an hour, but after that, I should be able to send you an email to give you some possible times to do that.
Great.
What other things do you want me to still try to talk a little bit about the things that we left yesterday, like how to do well with the additional kind of more complex second level models, or do you want to stop at this and continue some other day? Or do you have some specific questions about your data that you might want that it might be helpful to kind of look at in closer detail? What do you guys think? I
just have a question again in this GUI about the degrees of freedom for just the general display and the degrees of freedom. If I was running the second level analysis and I had decided that this was good and I was going on to just look at the control group, and I did 1, 0, 0, I noticed that the degrees of freedom includes the other group as well. So that's mathematically, even though I'm looking at one group, I still acknowledge all of the subjects in the whole model. Is that the way that works?
Right, because well, you can do it both ways. You could, if you want, just select the individual subjects and in that group and look at just a one sample t-test. But because you are trying to control for the effect of motion, and that effect is estimated across all of the subjects, then it's actually better to use the 1, 0, 0 in that case. And what it's basically doing is in the effect size, so that of what is happening in that group will mostly be affected by the average within that group, corrected for the effect of motion, whatever that motion, that effect was. It's only using the additional, the rest of the subjects are used for two things, for better estimating the effect of motion and for better estimating the residual between subjects variability, which comes in your statistics. So the effect sizes are not much affected by but the T statistics will get a little bit better because of the improved estimation of the variability. So it should look very similar. So in general, it should look very similar to if you just use those individual subjects. But in this case, well, it might not, because we saw that there was a huge motion effect, right? And the covariation with motion was probably large. So the correction for motion is playing an effect. So yeah, in this case, it might not be that similar. In a general case, when you do that, the one analysis where you include all of the subjects, even though you are looking at a subgroup of them, is typically referred as the simple main effects in an ANOVA settings, and then you're talking about the individual, looking at an effects that is only within one level of your factor, and the other one will be called one sample t-test within the individual group. So that's how you could refer them, and they are very similar in general, but they have very minor difference between them that have to do with how to estimate the residual variance, whether you use the other subjects that you don't care about or not for that estimation. Okay. So in your individual analysis, I would say yes, use the entire set, because that will give you a better ability to estimate the effect of motion, which is important in this data set.
Yes. Okay. Great. Thanks.
No problem. Okay. Anything else? Where's I lost my window.
I don't think there's any questions on our end. I know for my data, I still just need to go through the second level analysis. So I kind of just need some more time to play with it myself before I'll have, I'm assuming, more questions.
Okay, sounds good.
Thanks. Yeah.
So Jason, you're boss. What do you want to do? Oops, I think I can't hear you. You're muted, Jason.
There we are. One, I reject the idea of being the boss, but yeah, I'd be happy if we took a break. We stopped here, and I guess the one complicating factor is that I will be away from BU for most of next week. I may be there for some of Tuesday. Still trying to work out some travel plans, but other than the fact that I won't be around, I'm happy to meet with people too offline. So. These little mini, smaller time spurts, I think are good too. So let's take a break for this today, and then we've got plenty to still go over tutorially. So on Tuesday, for instance, should we just pick up? Maybe that's when we could go over some more complicated models, or
right. What I didn't speak of today, basically, that we could do next week is talking about that a little bit more complex models beyond the one sample to sample cases that we saw the other day, and also the things about multiple comparison correction, how to do the whole high threshold versus cluster threshold analysis,
right.
Non-parametric versus parametric statistics, all of those issues. I haven't talked about those, and that may be helpful to just hear them about the Eklund paper, all of those things. So we could do that on Tuesday if you want. What do you think? Yeah,
that sounds good. And like I said, I'm sort of like 50-50 on whether or not I'll be at BU on Tuesday afternoon. Like 75 to 80% likelihood that I'll be, if I'm not at BU, that I'll be able to attend.
Sounds good.
Okay.
So in principle, we'll try them next Tuesday, and if things changes,